Hey Bear Buddies, thanks for joining me for Volume 50 of Furberries Fables. If you enjoy it, please show your support by leaving a like and a comment down below. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing. Today's story is Eternal Wonder by Dan Soule. April Laverne was running to make her daddy dinner before he went on night shift. An apartment in the small project on the edge of town. Home was maybe a mile and a half from the high school on the opposite side of Jerusalem Falls. She checked her watch, a cheap thing her mother had left behind, and quickened her stride. April's long legs and slim waist drew Mr. Buckle's eyes while he swept down the sidewalk outside his hardware store. Since she'd bloomed 3 summers ago, which is how the ladies at the Women's Institute would put it, a silent covetousness followed the girl everywhere. This was something April was vaguely aware of, like questions people are too polite to ask. Where'd your mom run off to? Why's your daddy not remarried? April had too many other things to worry about. Making her pop's dinner, gaining ground on the kids who didn't have to make their father's dinner, and trying to get out of Jerusalem Falls were much more pressing. She had been chasing an A in English all year, putting in extra time in the library before she'd have to run home. It was a long but not a difficult run for April. She did it all the time to the crappy homes on the eastern edge of Jerusalem Falls. Her teachers had recommended that a girl like her focus on athletics, because a girl like her, as they put it, had at least a chance of a partial scholarship for athletics. But just because she lived on the edge of town didn't mean she was stupid. A partial scholarship was as good as no scholarship to a girl like April Laverne. All April knew was that she was never going to be able to run out of this town. Running was something she did because she had to. Reading and writing, however, was something she did because she loved them. She knew they were the things that would get her out of Jerusalem Falls somehow. Everyone else might think she was crazy. Even her English teacher, Teddy, who made all the kids call him by his first name, had given her an indulgent smile when she'd told him. He'd asked her if she wanted some extra tuition after school on Thursdays. April had jumped at the chance at first. Teddy put his hand on her leg, just above her knee, his fingers gently squeezing the flesh of her inner thigh through her jeans. April, he began, his hand rubbing up her leg in syncopation with his sympathetic tone. It's great to have dreams. What kind of educator would I be if I didn't encourage dreams? He was ancient, pushing 30, and the funk of crappy coffee hung on his breath. We dream best when our fantasies are things we can bring to reality. April put her hand on his, stopping its forward progression, and looked at her mother's watch. She feigned urgency and picked up her bag with a smile. As she left, Teddy called after her as if nothing had happened. Remember, there's a prize for the best creative writing assignment. Dream big on that one, kiddo. Blow me away with your talents. He'd winked at her, and she'd smiled indulgently at him this time. Thanks, Mr. Benedict. Call me Teddy. That was 2 weeks ago, and April had decided the library was a better use of her time than after-school sessions with Mr. Benedict. He might be a prick, but he was still her English teacher, and that was her passion. As she ran out of the center of town, April was thinking about the assignment. They all had to write a story behind a local business or building. It was the usual civic bullshit, town history crap teachers seemed unable not to set. As if working in the public school system had anesthetized their creativity, jabbing Novocaine into their expectations. But April knew what she would write about. She'd show them. She'd make the humdrum dramatic and visceral and sad. She'd make them see she wasn't the girl who needed to run out of this town, like her mother, or end up being some trophy barmaid wife waiting on her hubby to knock her up so they could begin the cycle again, or any of the other fucking white trash cliches she could perpetuate. She'd show them no one could keep her here, that she'd already left. She'd already danced with Maya Angelou, watched bullfights with Hemingway, gone to the center of the earth with Jules Verne. She had seen Maine with King, London with Herbert, and the belly of the beast with Lovecraft, and she'd explored inner space with Philip K. Dick and outer space with Asimov. Yeah, April would show them all she wasn't trapped in this small town, and she knew exactly what she would write about. Her dad had a stuffed raccoon. He'd hid it the night he'd met her mom, and as a joke, he got it stuffed at Eternal Wonder, Jerusalem Falls curiosity shop that did most of its trade doubling as a taxidermist, servicing the area's many hunters. The night he'd proposed, he got April's mom to close her green eyes. He lifted the raccoon out of a box hidden behind the couch, got down on one knee, and told her to open her eyes. She screamed and jumped back, cursing, then laughing at him as realization dawned. The raccoon had been frozen into a pose, standing on its hind legs, its lips pulled back in what was supposed to be a smile but looked like a grimace, its arms outstretched beseechingly. In its hands lay a thin, gold-plated ring, barely more than a cracker prize, but it was all he could afford. All April's life she'd heard the story, told over and over until the laughs had died to chuckles, chuckles to smiles, smiles to nods, and then to nothing. Her mom was gone, and the stupid raccoon stood on the sideboard in the hall by the telephone, its hands outstretched, beseeching, while her dad pretended to ignore it. The small collection of keys was at the bottom of her bag, under books and files. April squatted on her haunches, fishing around for them, breathing hard from the run. A pickup rolled by, catcalling her as she stood up. "Hey, darling, why don't you come and sit on this?" There was no point in turning around. She flipped them the bird, jogging up the short flight of steps to the block's front door. "Hey, you fucking bitch," came the delightful reply. There was more, but the slamming of the door and the echo of her footfalls on the stairs inside helped to muffle them. April dropped her keys at the raccoon's feet. "Is that you, hon?" her dad called from the bedroom. "Yeah, Dad, it's me. Dinner will be in 30, okay?" "That's great, hon. How was school?" When she did get away, he'd be the hardest thing to leave. She could always come back and visit. The bell rang overhead, one of those brass bells on the end of a coil. It had begun to rain outside, heavy droplets promising to wash away an oppressive humidity of late spring. Eternal Wonder was dark even before the overcast afternoon. The place looked as though it had been frozen in time somewhere between the world wars. The display cabinets were still the handmade kind of varnished pine, with brass handles and glass windows. The lampshades were of green glass, with the occasionally frosted white one, when the antique hand-blown stuff couldn't be found anymore. Dozens of animals' necks and heads poked out of the walls, staring down with glassy eyes, and smaller animals stood in various poses between trinkets and oddities. A Confederate officer's sword, a papyrus scroll, a letter from Ben Franklin, a Victorian snuff box, and so on. The stuffed animals were as disconcerting as the raccoon back home. It was the eyes, April always thought. Mr. Vattel was a great taxidermist. His work was in high demand here and from afar. The fur always lustered, the poses looked natural, but the eyes, the glassy eyes, betrayed death. All of them were a failed experiment to capture life. It was this, along with the rain on her skin, that made April shudder. Out of habit, April wiped her feet on the bristles of the welcome mat, waiting in the empty shop with her backpack on her shoulders. Her t-shirt was wet enough for the spotted pattern of her bra to begin to show through. She was already uncomfortable about the lumps of flesh on her chest, and now they drew even more conspicuous stares than her legs did. What irked April most was the fact that she could do nothing about any of it, other than cover them up. Even that didn't seem to matter most of the time. Boys stared. Girls stared. Men leered. Most of the time it was behind her back, or when they thought she wasn't looking. When she caught them staring, they'd look away, only for their eyes to be seemingly pulled back. It was as if she had a power that she didn't want and could not control, and which people judged her for anyway. It was too hot for a sweatshirt, and she'd forgotten her jacket rushing out of school for her appointment. The shop was stuffier still. April could feel her nipples harden with gooseflesh when her damp clothes began to dry in the heat. She didn't want to meet Mr. Vattel with arms folded across her chest, an entitled teenager wanting something for nothing, nor did she want her body to make a show of her to the old man. Shuffling came from the back of the store, through an open door behind the wide polished oak counter. April pulled her backpack from her shoulders, hugging it in front of her chest. "Hello, my dear," came a thin German accent. "How may I help you today?" "Hi, Mr. Vattel. It's me, April. April Laverne. I phoned you Saturday about coming to talk to you." The old man polished his gold-rimmed spectacles and put them back on, to squint down his nose at her. "Ah, yes, April. Like springtime, though not so much today, eh?" He chuckled, gesturing to the rain outside. Yes, well come in, my girl, let me see you." He waved her over to the counter. April approached, still hugging her school bag. The light was a little better at the counter, and Mr. Vattel looked up at April with gray, serious eyes. He smiled. "You, my dear, are the spitting image of your mother." "You knew my mother?" April was surprised. "Of course, how could I forget? She is a very beautiful woman, and your father had me stuff that raccoon for her. That still makes me laugh. You have her eyes. Did anyone ever tell you that? April shook her head, taken aback by the mention of her mother and the warmth with which he spoke of her. They didn't? That is a shame. Let me tell you a secret. The old man leaned in conspiratorially over the counter. The eyes are the secret to capturing a person's soul. Did you know that? April smiled indulgently. Yes, I think I've heard that someplace. The old man chuckled. Ha, you think I talk in cliches, but it is true, my dear. Study the great artists. They all mastered eyes. It is what marks them as masters. You are a writer, so you know writing is about recasting life's cliches in ways that make them seem anew. Oh, I'm not a writer, Mr. Vattel. Who says? The old man said wryly. I thought you wanted to write something about my shop. Yes, but it's only for a school project, April explained. What difference does that make? Don't you think Hess went to school? Did not Shakespeare study history and classics? Little Leo Tolstoy must have had a schoolmaster or an aristocratic tutor, must he not? I suppose so, she agreed tentatively. Good, good, Mr. Vattel said, lifting a section of the counter to let April through to the back. Come on through, and you can ask your questions, write your story, and capture it in forever, like a fly in amber. He led her to his workshop at the back of the store, and pulled on a short chain from a desk lamp swung low over his workstation. The light glared over the desk. He found her a stool to sit on. He sat at another opposite. On the desk was someone's pet cat, mounted on a small lawn of artificial grass. The cat was in mid-canter, its right muscles taut, the fur falling as if in a breeze. It was perfect, except for its eyes. It had none. Unnaturally empty sockets where they should have been. Two glass eyes lay on the desk looking in different directions. April stared at the blank holes. You like Chester? She hesitated, searching for the right word. Mr. Vattel guffawed, slapping his knee. He is a little creepy, eh? The eyes will finish him off. Mrs. Fisher will be quite pleased to have him back home forever. No more eating poisoned rats, he said to the cat, scratching behind its lifeless ear. Anyway, my dear, ask your questions. April pulled a notepad and pen from her school bag, her skin still goosebumped. She wanted to cover herself, her damp t-shirt, her chest, her everything, but she couldn't do that and write. When she looked up to ask her first question, Mr. Vattel looked at nothing but her eyes. She relaxed a little, checking where to start. When did you open the store? In 1946. I came to America from Germany after the war, but I did not open the store. I don't understand. I did not open the store because it was already here. I merely took over its ownership and running. I believe Eternal Wonder has been here for a great many years. In fact, I took over from a Mr. Mortimer, and he took it over from a Mr. and Mrs. Iokwa. And before them, I do not know. April wrinkled her brow. That would make the store as old as the town. Older still, perhaps, suggested Mr. Vattel, his gray eyes gleaming. But that is not possible. So young and so sure of everything, the old man smiled. He bent down, pulling a box across the floor, sending dust into the air. He coughed, flapping it away. I thought you might be interested in these. They are the store's ledgers. The store has been on this spot since 1692. It seems it serviced the fur trade and those brave souls heading west when the way opened up, providing them with stocks and supplies, and trading in trinkets and wonders, hence the name. April smiled politely. Mr. Vattel, that would make this one of the oldest buildings in America, but it's not in any of the history books. I checked in the library. My dear, I didn't say it was the same building, only that it was on this spot. I'm quite sure it has been rebuilt several times. It is all in the ledgers. Quite the story it will make, yes? Indeed it would. April's pen hesitated above her pad. But, the elderly German went on, that was not the story you wanted to tell. April shook her head in confirmation. Ah, I see your mother in you again. Though you should remember all this, he gestured to the building around them, and the box of ledgers, is nothing but detail. Though they are solid and permanent, they are nothing without the people who pass through them. Life is effervescent, but art is eternal. Is that not why you write? To capture the ephemeral? Ledgers, old buildings, these things are not art, but they could be the details of a great story, the most wondrous story never told, until... He paused, his gray eyes locked on hers. You write it. The old man smiled once more. April smiled back. A full, truthful smile. Yes, that was it. This old guy got it. He got it more than anyone in this nowhere town. Tea, said Mr. Vattel. I shall make tea, and you will ask your questions, Miss April Laverne. He got up, switched on a tea kettle, and began to fiddle with cups and a jug of milk. I wanted to ask about our raccoon. You said you remember doing it? Yes, quite the job. Your father came in with it in a box. I said I didn't stuff roadkill. You should have seen it. Your father must have scraped it off the road. It was not in good condition. Stitching up a bullet hole in a whitetail is one thing, but torn flesh is altogether different. Typically I would have refused, he said, pouring boiling water over the tea leaves and stirring them in the pot with a wooden spoon. But when he told me his plan, I couldn't resist. What was his plan? April wrote, trying to keep up. He told me he'd met the woman he was going to marry. Mr. Vattel poured the tea and brought it over to them. Your father said he hit the raccoon on their first date and wanted to use it to propose to her. Till death do us part, I think was the joke, kind of a metaphor. As a taxidermist, I appreciated it. It still makes me laugh 20 years later. Drink your tea, dear, while it is still hot. April took a sip. It was hot and sweet, with a bitter aftertaste, but not unpleasant, relaxing. Do you have to do that kind of thing often? Engagement surprises and things? No, my dear. Hunters and pet owners are my stock and trade. I also get a steady stream of specialist collectors from all over, and the occasional museum piece. You look a little cold, my dear. Have some more tea to warm up. April took another sip. She did feel cold, and sick, too. Nothing bad, just like the beginning of motion sickness on a car journey. Do you remember how much he paid? The old man crowed. $20, I think. I can look it up, but I gave him a discount. Why? Because he made me laugh, and because it was for love, so I gave him something else, too. What? April hadn't heard this part of the story before. A wish. A wish? The old man tilted his head, enjoying the skepticism he saw in the young woman opposite him. I can see you don't believe me, but the custom where I am from is to give a wish with the gift. Oh, that rhymes. Sounds like an enchantment, doesn't it? Joked the old taxidermist. Can I ask what it was? Said April, writing feverishly, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin with a wave of nausea, so that she had to swallow it back and take another sip of tea. Wishes are usually sacred things to be kept to yourself. Is that not so, Miss Laverne? There was a touch of the dramatic in his delivery. Feeling sick and disappointed, April said, I guess so. Don't look so down. I'm only pulling your leg. But are you all right, my dear? Finish your tea, it'll help. April drank the last of her tea. The bottom of the cup was twice as sweet and twice as bitter as the rest, and she felt a little woozy. On this occasion, you are in luck with the wish. Pardon my pun, Mr. Vattel chuckled. Wishes cannot be disclosed by the wisher. The same covenant doesn't bind the giver of the wish. Remember, the jinn in Aladdin is all-powerful, apart from the shackles of the lamp, of course. But we are all shackled by something, aren't we? Usually it is ourselves. Mind-forged manacles. Isn't that what Mr. Blake called them? Oh, my dear, are you all right? The room began to go out of focus for April. She slumped forward off the stool onto her knees and puked between Mr. Vattel's feet, her stomach cramping, trying to cleanse her of the poison. Mr. Vattel stroked the back of her long brown hair that now dangled over her face, becoming wet with saliva and vomit as she retched again, expelling hot liquid onto the floor. There, my dear. It is all right. It will pass. Before you lose consciousness, let me tell you of your father's wish. I asked him to make the lover's wish. I asked him to wish that she, your mother, would never leave. And you know what he did? Like all those given a wish, he wished for too much. He said it right in front of me. Right in this very store. His words came in distorted echoes of a kid shouting into a tin can, where all the bass and high notes are amplified, muscling out the mid-range. He wished they would have a family, and they would never leave. That they would always be close. April's arms gave way, slipping in the contents of her stomach. Her face hit the flagstone floor with a wet slap. Cold pins and needles pricked at her extremities, traveling up her limbs, overcoming her body until she could feel nothing of the room around her. Finally, all was black. April's green eyes opened to a beautiful shaft of golden light. Dust fairies danced around in the beam. Her head was clear. She did not feel hot or cold or sick anymore. She felt much better. She thought of breathing in and stretching her limbs to take in her surroundings. As she tried, April realized her chest could not move. She panicked, trying to breathe, to gasp, to struggle, but she could not. It was not only that she could not move, but that she had no sense of the external world other than that beam of light. She couldn't feel the air on her skin, nor the weight of her limbs, nor the texture of her clothes. For a moment, her mind jumped to the thought that Mr. Vattel had drugged her and stripped her naked, exposing her blossoming body, that the kindly old man was no such thing, and he had had his way with her, doing what all those covetous stares had desired. She had then not exactly a memory, but an awareness of being lifted and then stripped. Oh my God, she thought. No, he didn't, she pleaded. Then there was tugging. No, she shouted in her mind, because the words would not come out. A tugging, but not down there, not between her legs as Johnny Steiner had tried to do once at a school dance, and Teddy Benedict wanted to do, and more. No, the tugging was higher, at her navel. No, not at her navel, but in her navel, inside her stomach. Things were being pulled out. All of it was being pulled out, one by one. Her intestines, her bladder, her liver, kidneys, spleen, her appendix, her uterus, and then, finally, each lung. But not her heart. He left her heart beating without blood. The tugging was replaced by stuffing and the smell of herbs and incense and sounds, a chanting that vibrated in a low guttural hum, in a language April did not understand. A blinding white light and a ringing grew from the ceremony. They grew in tandem, expanding, growing huge and terrifying, consuming, propagated by the chanting, nurtured by the herbs and incense, until the light became a scream, and the ringing a glare of vibration, so that sound was light and light was sound, snuffing the other out to blackness. Beyond this memory, this awareness, April realized there was more than the beam of light, wherever she now was. Although nothing else would move, April could move her eyes. She was in a room, possibly a basement of some kind, with rough walls cut from the stone of the earth. Maybe the light came from a small window. Escape, therefore, might be possible, if she could gather more information, deduce the exact conditions of her surroundings. What her wandering eye found would have produced a scream, if only she still had a tongue and vocal cords to produce it. Tom Robertson crouched on one knee at the end of the beam of light. He was dressed in his high school quarterback's uniform, one hand on his knee, the other leaning on a football, his natural boyish smile playing on his face. But Tom Robertson, the first guy to get a full ride at Penn State to play football, hadn't been seen for 10 years. The Tom Robertson here hadn't aged a day. April knew him because everyone had heard the story of Tom Robertson disappearing, running away from all the pressure and all the expectations. There he was, perfectly frozen in time. Then his eyes, and only his eyes, moved. April would have gasped. Would have, if only she could have. Next to Tom was little Gracie Mae Dunbar, 4 years old and in the arms of her drunk daddy. The taxidermist had captured their reality. Gracie Mae, beautiful and innocent, her dirty blonde curls playing around her face. Her daddy, drunk and ruddy, with a cigarette and a quarter of rye in his free hand. They stood in tableau as they would have been 30 years ago, when drunk old dad tried to steal away Gracie Mae to head out west to a Californian pipe dream. There was still more April could see. A young woman, a few years older than her, with bobbed hair and a miniskirt. A soldier in World War II uniform, a kit bag slung over his shoulder, a back-by-Christmas smile on his face, and sad brown eyes that looked at April like Mr. Johnson's Labrador from across the hall. A lady with a corset, petticoats, and wide-brimmed hat sat on a patch of modeling grass, forever feeding a cube of cheese to a miniature poodle sitting on its hind legs. A schoolboy with muddy knees, an old woman in a wheelchair, an African-American man, a broken chain around his ankle, scars from lashes across his shoulders. A Native American sitting on beaver pelts for sale and a bearskin shawl to keep him warm. In the back, by cave-like walls, a Viking, a goddamn Viking, replete with a mane of red hair, dirty beard, axe and shield, and eyes that glared with madness. And beyond him, in the grubby shadows of oil lamps, still more, even older frozen shapes. Also different, but with one thing in common. The life in their eyes, which looked between each other and to April. Finally, coming back from the shadows at the back of the cave, she saw her. Green eyes exactly like her own. Her hands outstretched beseechingly to her daughter, whose own hand gestured out longingly to her mother, frozen together forever, never leaving.